Hello everyone, I'd like to talk to you today about John Locke and George Berkeley, later in his life Bishop Berkeley. Locke is a British philosopher, the first major empiricist one could say. Usually you study John Locke, David Hume, and George Berkeley, and his name is spelled like Berkeley but pronounced Berkeley, and Berkeley is from Kilcoyne, Ireland. But first John Locke, because Locke says some things that Berkeley ends up reacting to. So in 1690, Locke lived from 1632 to 1704. In 1690, at the age of 58, he writes these two great books. An essay on human understanding, which is this four-part book, some 400 pages. And then he also writes Second Treatise on Civil Government, which, by the way, becomes the blueprint for the Constitution of the United States. Thomas Jefferson read it and said it's perfect as far as it goes. The perfect ideas for American government. So Locke is as influential as anyone for what was done with the Constitution. So in the essay on human understanding, Locke has read Descartes, and one of the first things he does is to reject the idea that there are innate ideas. In fact, the first book of his 4 books of the essay is to reject what Descartes had to say. Remember that Descartes had said that we have innate ideas of mathematics and an innate idea of God, logical principles like the law of identity, A is the A. Locke rejects any of that. Locke says there's nothing in the mind that was not first in the senses. Another way he puts that's the least famous of the 2 quotes. The more famous is that we are like a blank slate, or a tabula rasa. We come into this world with no ideas etched in our minds, and only experience writes ideas on our minds. And so we take in information through the inlets of the 5 senses: sense of taste, sense of touch, sense of hearing, sight, and so forth. So I learned that the smell of a flower by my sense of smell. I learned the taste of the wine that's bitter. I didn't have any of these ideas prior to my sensing them. So it's impossible to have any ideas at all that didn't come to me through my senses first. And so when he says that all knowledge comes from experience, he means experience in some larger sense, but starts with sense experiences. I know that is hard if I give it a rep, but I didn't know that was hard prior to my sensation of it. So he really is very harsh on Descartes' idea that there are innate ideas. He says there can't be any innate ideas, otherwise children and idiots would know them. So I think he has the better of this argument. Think about math. Did we know that 3 times 3 equals 9 when we first came into this world? Did we know Aristotle's law of identity, one of his 3 laws, that A is equal to A, everything is equal to itself? Did we know the existence of God, as Descartes says, is stamped on the soul at birth? It doesn't seem that that's likely, that all those things, according to Locke, would have to be learned. Now, Locke then talks about simple ideas, complex ideas, primary qualities, and secondary qualities. I'd like to go right to the primary and secondary qualities. He's a man of science. He, like Galileo, believes that the world is matter in motion. As a person who passed the test to be a doctor, Locke, he becomes a philosopher instead. But he, like Galileo, again, matter is in motion. That's really, at its most basic level, that's what's going on in the real world. And so, primary qualities, by calling them primary, he thinks they deserve pride of place. They are things that are measurable. What kinds of things are primary qualities? Well, if you're looking at a door, and a door is, let's say, 8 feet high and 3 feet wide, it's the mass of the door, the shape of the door, whether it's at motion or rest. These things are primary, Locke says. Why? Again, he's giving them pride of place because he's a man of science and math, but also they're objective. They're not in me. He says they inhere in bodies themselves. They really are there in the door. The secondary qualities, though, are something I contribute. The secondary qualities, like the color, the taste of things, the sound of things, those are qualities that the primary qualities have a capacity to incite in me, he says. And so he has an example of porphyry. Porphyry is this red stone, and it looks like it's a valuable stone, like a ruby. Or is it? comes up in the essay. He says, well, if you put it in this kind of light, it appears clear and worthless like glass. But put it in this other light, and it appears like this ruby, again, that has value, like a valuable stone that you might use to make a piece of jewelry. Which is it? Well, we don't really know in itself what it is, according to Locke. So we only have the appearance of the thing. And so there's a case where the color red, this rich red color, is kind of in me. It's not in the thing itself, Locke thinks. And we can learn more about color spectrum since Locke, but this is what he thought, that those things are kind of secondary, not primary. Then too, there's other examples of why this Locke has a good argument here. A person who's used to drinking hard liquor would taste a glass of wine and say, well, that's sweet, that's not really good. A person who drinks no liquor at all might taste that same glass of wine and say, well, that's bitter. Because relative to what they're used to having, that'll affect their opinion of it. So if you come in from a frigid environment, outdoors let's say, and sink your hand into a bowl of warm water, that's going to appear hot to you because you just came from a very cold environment. If you came from a sweltering environment, on the other hand, and put your hand into that bowl of warm water, it'll appear cool relative to where you just were. So Locke has a pretty good argument for the secondary qualities, the ones that seem to be based, are in me to some extent, based, relatively based on people's sense information. Then too, he says there are different kinds of knowledge, different degrees of knowledge. So there's sensory knowledge, intuitive knowledge, and demonstrative knowledge. Which is the highest intuitive knowledge? And here he shows some agreement with Descartes. Descartes had said, I think, therefore I am, and to argue for the self or the existence of the I. Locke agrees with that argument, that it's just known intuitively. It's an immediate apprehension of some truth and can't be denied. And I have talked about how Descartes, it's hard to refute that argument. If I'm thinking, I must exist. The second level of knowledge, Locke says, is demonstrative knowledge. If I say all persons are mortal and Joe is a man, then I conclude that Joe is mortal. However, I only got to Joe and mortal by knowing first the intermediate steps, that all persons were mortal and that Joe is a person. Without those intermediate steps, I couldn't have gotten to the conclusion that Joe is mortal. So this is what he calls demonstrative knowledge. It's not immediate notice. It's not. It has to be demonstrated with a series of steps. That's called. That happens to be what I just used as an Aristotelian syllogism in logic. Syllogism is a deductive argument with at least two premises and a conclusion. Third, there's sensible knowledge. You might find it odd that he would rank this lowest, sensible knowledge. After all, he is an empiricist, and he says knowledge begins with sense experience. But here's why. Even though I sense the door is 3 feet by 6 feet, and I think that's an objective property about the door, and I think it has a walnut grain, kind of brown, almost a striped look to it, and it's dark colored, and it has a certain smell. When I walk by it, it's been newly painted, let's say. I don't know if that's the way the world really is. So my sensation of the world, I cannot be sure that the world is really that way. So Locke is called a representative realist. I think that the world outside of my mind is as it appears to me, but I can never really be sure. He's called a representative realist. He didn't call himself that, but scholars have called him a representative realist because he thinks that what we get through our senses is some representation of the external world, without knowing that that's the way it really is. So sensible knowledge comes last. He does fashion a proof of God's existence, different than Descartes. Descartes has two rational proofs. He was a rationalist. Locke, as an empiricist, has a kind of design argument that comes after St. Thomas Aquinas' design argument, argument 5, St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. Locke here in the 18th century. But his argument is that the world is an orderly place. This we can experience. It's a mechanistic place. It's governed by laws of motion, laws of gravity. So how did that come to pass? There must have been some great mind that organized that world. So that's the kind of argument that you would expect an empiricist to have. Locke, of course, is an empiricist. That word, empiricist, is a Greek word meaning experience, that you know the truth from experience. So Locke is really a fascinating person. Bertrand Russell, a 20th century philosopher who lived from 1872 to 1970, 98 years, looked at Locke and said it's, also from Great Britain, Russell, said that most all of his philosophy is agreeable. There's hardly anything you'd want to pick out as being disagreeable, and he thought that that was kind of part and parcel of his reputation. Now Berkeley comes along and does not agree with Locke on many of these thoughts. Locke had said that there are these primary qualities, and so there are these things that are really in bodies that are out there in the world that don't depend on my perception of them. What we now call matter. But Berkeley sets out to, his whole philosophy is centered around this idea of disproving matter. And so he wrote 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philinus, and wrote his best works in his 20s, which is very different than Locke, who wrote his best work at 58. But Berkeley sets out to say that Locke's distinction between primary qualities, as objective, and secondary qualities, the ones that are in me, like smells and taste, is not a real distinction at all. It's a distinction without a difference, you might say. The two things are one and the same. All I know, Berkeley says, are the ideas in my head. So, and he quotes Locke as saying that very thing. All I can be sure of are the ideas in my mind. And so this is called, if Locke is a representative realist, Berkeley is an idealist. The only real thing are ideas. So there is no matter out in the world that exists if you think of matter as a primary substance, as Locke described it, that exists independent of me. Somehow it's there when I'm not looking. It doesn't need my perception of it. By contrast with Locke, Berkeley has this idea that esse est percipi, which means to be is to be perceived. That something does not exist unless it's being perceived, either in God's mind or a human mind. I suppose you can extend that to mean an animal mind. We've heard this old query, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, these days we would say sound is a wave, and so yes, it does. But if you mean by sound something that's perceptible by a human mind, an animal mind, or God's mind, then no, it does not. Well, yes, it does. I'm sorry. Let's start that again. There's that old query that if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, if you think that sound is a wave, as people do think these days, then in fact it does make a sound without me hearing it. But if you think a sound is defined as something that's audible to human or animal ears, then it would not. Berkeley would say yes, it does, because even when humans are not around or animal minds are not around, God is there to perceive it. And so it's God's perception that keeps the world up and running. So it's interesting to me that he rejects Locke's idea of matter. But what plays the role of matter in Berkeley's philosophy? It's God. God is there to perceive things when I'm not perceiving them. So if we leave this room and there's no one there to perceive the shelves and the books, how do they stay in existence? Or how does the universe stay in existence when no one was there to apprehend it before there were any human beings 2 million years ago, or prior to there being any animals, longer before that? Who was perceiving it? God was perceiving it. And so this is his idea, the esse est percipi. So Locke wants to say, again, Locke wants to say that all we know are the ideas in our minds, and Berkeley says if you take him at his word, then yes, we only know ideas of things. Some people call it sense data, and Berkeley anticipates this idea of sense data. I know the door as being rectangular and brown, and for those two, rectangularity as a primary quality, as Locke would say, and brown as a secondary quality, no, those are one and the same. They're conflated according to Berkeley. They're in my head at the same time. So there's a disagreement there, two empiricists disagreeing on this very thing. Also, Locke has this idea of substance, and that is, he says, something I know not what, that holds together all the perceivable properties of a thing. So if you're looking at an apple, and the apple is 2 inches high, it's red and it's crunchy in taste, Locke says there must be something standing under that to hold those properties. So substance literally standing under it. Even though I can't perceive it, it's holding those qualities together so that whenever I see an apple, those things are united. Hume will jump all over this, saying if you're an empiricist, you can't maintain the existence of something that can't be observed. And Locke, Berkeley, for a different reason, rejects that, saying that God would play the role of that, of the supporting that being in existence. Hume will then, when we look at Hume will take issue with both their philosophies, the ideas of God, substance, the self. Hume will reject all of these. But I just wanted to give you a beginning now with Locke and Berkeley and show where they differ. They are part of the same tradition, but they have basic differences in their thought. So that's all for now, and thank you very much.